Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first installment of the Financial Mail Green Economy Dialogues live in partnership with Sanlam Investments, Liberty 2 Degree, and DBSA. My name is Andile Khumalo, and I will be your host for the next hour or so as we delve into our theme, Positive Impact Through Sustainable Investing. In case it's been a while since you've attended one of these online versions, I know, of course, the world is opening up a little bit, so it may have been a bit of a while since you've attended. No worries. The drill is still very similar. If you are struggling to connect, it's best that you just disconnect and try and reconnect again. If you have load shedding, do the same as well. Don't freak out. It's likely to happen in the country that we live in, which is a topic we'll touch on, of course, a little bit later on this particular conversation. And if, of course, you have any questions, please, you're most welcome to put questions to our panel. You just go to the chat and, of course, you send through your questions and I will get them directly. And about just 15 minutes or so to go, I will be able to pose those to my esteemed panelists. Now, of course, the topic we're discussing today is the positive impact we can make in the world through sustainable investing. It's a world that is now driven by innovation and change. So going green has become an imperative factor in mitigating climate change impact and ensuring environmental well-being. ESG, or rather environmental, social, and governance, has become a very viable strategy for most investors who seek to invest in and support the transition to a more climate-resilient, non-carbon-based, and also a sustainable, socially inclusive economy. The word there that I have learned in the past few days is just transition. You're going to hear it featuring a lot today. And of course, the other impact that it all comes with is the reporting. Whether you're a listed company, whether you're a pension fund, whether you're an operational business like one of my guests today, how do you make sure that whatever it is that you're doing, you are able to report it in a way that is showing real numbers and real measurable impact, and not just the input or the things you're doing, but also the impact that these things are having as well. And of course, the big question when it comes to investments is, what is the balance between, call it, the right climate change results or ESG outcomes versus financial return, the chase of the alpha, as the asset managers tend to call it. Of course, I have a panel with me that's going to touch on all of these and more. Feel free to post your questions. Let me now introduce you to our panel. Brian Unsted is the asset management executive and also the head of something called Good Spaces at Liberty 2 Degrees. He's joining us as well this morning. Olympus Manthata, he's the head of climate finance for the DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa. You know them as a DFI. They are a big player in the space of sustainable and impact investing. He's joining us this morning. And last but not least, from Sanlam Investments is the head of distribution there, Mr. Jason Liddle. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Good to see you bright and early. We're going to be engaging on a lot of things this morning. ESG is a big topic, of course. Reporting it is a big topic, of course. But the biggest topic, I guess, is about how each of you are playing your part in making sure that you are running your businesses in a sustainable way and in a way that shows that you are doing your best in maintaining the environment. So let me start with you, Brian. Good Spaces. Just tell us a bit more about what it is and how Liberty 2 Degrees, as an owner of retail malls and shopping centers around the world, some of the biggest ones, including Sandton City, Eastgate Shopping Center that we know in Johannesburg, all the way to Midlands Mall in Pietermaritzburg, Promenade in Cape Town. How does an owner of a retail mall network play a role in preserving the environment and doing what's responsible insofar as climate change is concerned?
Good morning, Andile. Well, we at the Good Spaces, let's start with that. Good Spaces is one of our pillars of our business. It is around looking towards the future and recognizing that we can't just do business the way that we've done it in the past. We have to accept that things have changed, that we, the days of relying on Eskom for stable energy supply, etc., is not practical these days. We have to look at alternate energy sources and backup suppliers. And we just recognized and have embraced as a business at Liberty 2 Degrees that we need to accept the world as it is, and we can't look back. We need to look forward, and we're doing as much as we possibly can to try and make changes, meaningful changes, in the way that we run our business. And we've adopted sort of 4 key strategies around Good Spaces. which is around getting accreditation for all of our buildings, and then chasing net zero targets for waste, water, and energy, and setting commitments around that and target dates around that. Nothing to focus the mind like setting a commitment.
And of course, as a listed company, the focus of investors, the general public, we retail investors, we're constantly looking through your annual report or integrated report rather, and we're looking for practical things that you are doing in your physical stores, because it's a relatively simple business to understand, right? You've got physical malls that you've got clients who are tenants. What practical things is the business doing to make sure that there's a minimal and a light touch on the environment in a practical way?
So the one that we've been chasing really hard, Andile, is net zero waste. And we've managed to improve our diversion rates from landfill from about 35 to 40% last year. At the beginning of the year, we are now over 80% diversion from landfill. And as you say, in big malls that we operate, there's a lot of waste that does come out of these facilities, and a lot of that is being recycled. We've got massive industrial scale composting facilities where a lot of the food waste and that goes, biobins. So we're doing a lot in that space. We're also doing a lot in the energy space. So the big buzzword as well at the moment is around solar PV plants. We have installed 2 already at Eastgate and Midlands Mall. And we now are about to commission our 3rd one in Cape Town at Promenade. And we will be looking at expansions on some of the existing facilities as well as a rollout on all of our retail facilities. And then with water is a difficult one, but we're looking at rainwater harvesting facilities. I think we need to make use of the abundant rainfall when we have it, and that we will be making use of. And then just reducing consumption as well. There's a whole lot of different angles that we need to look at to achieve these targets. And consumption is a big one, putting in low flow taps in the bathrooms, getting our retailers and our tenants to use less water, as well as looking at our air conditioning systems are big users of water traditionally. And as we're replacing that capital equipment, using more efficient capital equipment, that'll be, as you say, lighter on the planet.
Absolutely. We're going to get into, of course, the bigger, broader issues, but thank you for that introduction, at least to understand how L2D is doing its part. Let's move on to the DBSA. Olympus, I had a bit of a read at your division, the climate finance division. It's a hell of a name as well. It's like, climate finance, very interesting. And it said that the DBSA's objective is to mobilize funding, which will be used for the purpose of developing sustainable and environmentally friendly infrastructure solutions. How do you guys go about doing that practically?
Thank you very much, Andile. I think, our starting point is really to say that, I think the debate around whether we should be concentrating on climate issues, I think, at least from where I'm standing, it is settled. The issue is really what is the practical ways of ensuring that we respond with the agency that the subject deserves. And from our side, obviously from a climate financing point of view, the starting point is to say there's significant amount of financing required if we are to move the needle with the speed that is required, as I've mentioned earlier. So what we do specifically from the climate and environment finance side is really to ensure that we mobilize appropriate financial resources, in the main concessional financial resources, which we then use to blend with own DBSA resources. The idea being to unlock projects of a climate nature, and this would talk to projects in the mitigation and adaptation area. And that's really what we concentrate on doing. And part of how we do this would be either through, accreditations that we have in place with your United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, which is really facilities that are put in place to help, in the main, developing countries to finance activities that would support the climate agenda. And we use our accreditation really to access these resources, pass it on to, mainly project sponsor within the public and the private space, with the view of accelerating, implementing this type of projects. So at a very high level, that's what we do. And I'd be happy to talk a lot more in details later.
Absolutely. I'm interested in the detail around the climate financing facility, because that seems to be kind of your flagship product. Just tell us a bit more about it, and how does it leverage and kind of encourage, or at least galvanize, both the public sector and the private sector and DFIs and countries as well to see these projects as viable projects? Because I often wonder, to what extent do we meet each other between, call it the private sector that's kind of out there for a very clear financial return, but of course the ESG returns that we would like to see, because that's what impact investing is about.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So again, going back, the idea for us was to say, you need significant resources to do this work that is before us. Your public resources alone aren't going to be sufficient to do this. So you need an innovative way of using your public resources to leverage private resources in a way that you can be able to increase significantly financial flows into both mitigation and adaptation projects. So with our climate finance facility, what we actually did was to say, if you would want to unlock private sector financing into the space, you need to, as a starting point, understand what are the barriers. So we started by really, engaging with various sectors within the private financing space to understand what the barriers are for them to be able to increase financial flows into the space. And just in short, the two key barriers that we found out was, where you're dealing with new technologies, there is a need to de-risk those type of projects to be able to, bring in a private investment. The other thing, especially with commercial banks, that came out strongly was, the need to deal with long tenures. For example, where there could be limitations for commercial banks, maybe due to Basel III regulations, to go for long tenures. The idea was then to say, if we come in with a product where we are able to, in structuring investment, take the longer side of the tenure, we could be able to then unlock the ability of, private investment to come in. So we then went on to design this climate finance facility to exactly unlock the barriers that have been identified. So this facility that we have now put in place is actually funded on a 50-50 basis with the Green Climate Fund. And the idea was really to say, on a typical financing structure, we would provide, let's say 30% of the financing required, as a subordinated tranche, either to, to de-risk the project or to take the longer side of the tenure. And then we would expect that if your project sponsor would come in, let's say 20% in equity, it would be a lot easier to then raise the 50% from, other sources of financing, especially private financing, and therefore increase the financial flows into this project. So that's the facility that we have in place. Right. And it operates in 4 countries mainly: South Africa, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia. And the idea was really, to use the common monetary area just to alleviate issues around forest exchange issues. So yes, that's the facility that we are currently implementing.
Great stuff, Olympus, and I can see the very clear role of a DFI, particularly of a DBSA and all of that in de-risking some of these projects, in taking on the more non-commercial return perspective. And of course, you're still a financial institution, so you also want your commercial returns. Let's talk to Jason Liddle, who's coming from an industry that is world renowned for only caring about financial returns. And that's what asset managers are often seen as. They talk about this alpha, this return that's higher than the benchmark, and how everybody's trying to beat it, right? How everybody's trying to get to it. Jason, you are heading up distribution at Sanlam Investments. As an asset manager, ESG has become a big part of your life. I'm very interested in how you guys practically show leadership in this instance, specifically when it comes to mobilizing capital towards impact investing, especially because it's not that you are the one chasing the alpha, it's that you're managing other people's money and they're looking for those returns. How is the conversation on ESG landing with investors in kind of your experience?
Thanks very much, Andile, and good morning. Sanlam Investments definitely recognizes we play a very critical role also within the industry that we actually work to sort of collectively forge ahead towards the various ambitions that we have in the greener economy. When it comes to clients, I think clients themselves are recognizing on a global and at a local level the importance of what the role that climate is playing inside the agendas. And we've certainly seen that when we've measured things over time, 2 years ago, currently, and what's expected ahead, that climate is certainly going to become a little bit more part and parcel of the agenda. But then as an asset manager, our role is a little bit more holistic, both on the listed and the unlisted side of things. As we work with our clients, whether it be asset custodians, fiduciaries, or retirement fund trustees, helping them adhere to sort of regulations or sustainability frameworks where our decision making is a bit more complete, or adhere to reporting taxonomies in place towards better outcomes. But then, as you say, as well, our role is also in mobilizing capital for impact and making sure that our current asset base is a lot more embedded with ESG-driven principles and processes as well. You know, our role is not just then confined to the private sector side of things. We work very constructively with DFIs out there, and certainly an example of that is in our climate fund business, where we raised about $850 million worth of funding towards renewables in Climate Fund 1, or in Climate Fund 2, which is a water and sanitation fund, raising about $900 billion towards projects around impact. From a client point of view, I think there's better recognition that forging ahead with your impact agenda or your ESG agenda does not come at the cost of financial returns, or, as you say, alpha. But also it's important that we as asset managers provide the innovative mechanisms and vehicles where we can balance the objectives of a broad range of stakeholders around risk, return, as well as impact, from those that are aid organizations that just philanthropically want to forge ahead with scale and impact, to DFIs where there's a balance around it, towards investors that are also a little bit more or have the needle a little bit more on return and less on impact, towards those that are just completely investment target driven. And so blended finance mechanisms is something that we've innovatively come up with as well to help all of those stakeholders balance their objectives while still being able to sustain and create those fantastic real world outcomes.
Let's stay with that theme a little bit, gentlemen, and let me come right back to you, Brian. This debate or this theme of impact investing or investing in initiatives that ensure that there's as light as possible a touch on the environment so that we respond to the threat of climate change, which is a very real thing already. We can already see what's happening in our own country. But there is still a community of people that may not be putting it out into the public domain, that these things cost money. You know, it kind of reminds me of PE back in the days, you know, cost of transformation. There's almost a cost to the climate change. You were talking earlier on about all the things you're doing in your various malls. Obviously, as a responsible business, you've got to be responsible. But how do you say to someone who goes, is this worth the spend? Is this worth the investment? In your environment, it's an investment because it's money you would otherwise, quote unquote, not have, you know, may not have used. In Jason's world, it's potentially less returns than you would have gotten. Is it worth it, Brian? Is it worth it?
It absolutely is. I guess it's a short-term view versus a long-term view. And you know, doing business as we used to do it, it's just impossible. I suppose the reality is, with the increases in the cost of energy through Eskom as well, it is actually helping the returns of projects like solar. So we're doing the right thing, and we're keeping our accountants happy. I think so a lot of the projects that we're doing have actually got very strong returns. Others don't have as stronger returns, but certainly in the solar space, there is the very good returns, and obviously with the amount of sunlight that we have in our weather conditions in this country, in which we operate as Liberty 2 degrees, every project that we've looked at has got a very positive financial return that's exceeding our hurdle rates. But yeah, I think it's also around business resilience. So it's not purely a financial play, but most of the projects we presented do have an immediate positive financial play as well. But yeah, it's the resilience, as I spoke about earlier in my opening comments, about the reliance on Eskom, water supply. We've got tanks in all of our centers in case we have an unstable water supply, so we can keep our malls operating. So there's a couple of elements. It's not purely financial, but yes, I don't think anybody that's investing is happy if you tell them that they're going to be getting less money. But if you tell them in the long run, over 10 years, you stay invested in this fund, you've got a better chance of a long-term, financial outcome as an investor.
Right. And Olympus, in your world, as a DFI already, I guess the expectation is to be more developmental in your outlook. But do you go to your exco and you sit amongst the other guys that are funding, let's call it more commercial ventures, and as head of climate finance, you sit there and you go, oh, well, the perception here is that, all the projects I'll be financing will by definition have lower returns. So I always have to defend my position. Or does it matter what type of investment it is? I mean, does it follow that if I'm investing in something that's going to have an impact outcome, I will absolutely get lower returns?
From my understanding, I think that the responsible thing is to fully appreciate what is the impact of climate on the investment that you are putting in place. And I think Brian was correct talking about whether you're taking a short-term view versus a long-term view. You might look like you are doing the correct thing if you are chasing a return against the potential impact of climate in the short term. But when the impact of climate hits, you might end up having no return to talk to. If you think about it from a development point of view, you can take shortcuts in terms of what you think will bring about the correct level of impact in communities. But I think recent evidence does show that if you do not consider climate appropriately, what you consider to have been progress could be wiped out in a very short space of time. Therefore, you would have done irresponsible investment, in my view. So it is important in considering your investment to ensure that you climate-proof them, if I can use that word, in as much as it is possible. But just to go on your merry way and not consider the impact that are becoming very clear to us recently, I think that would be very irresponsible. And I think there is no way you could justify that to say it supports your returns, because it doesn't.
Absolutely. And Jason, I guess in your world, one of the points you certainly made in the past is the impact of the S in ESG, right? We tend to speak a lot about the E, but perhaps not often enough about how the E relates to the S. In your view, how does the environment touch on socioeconomic issues and issues that affect normal people and not necessarily just the investment community?
Thanks, Andile. I think it's a very pertinent question. I think just even given, the weekend that's just passed, in KwaZulu-Natal, I think they're hit by their second wave of floods and torrential rains. I think we know how wildfires have impacted large swaths of Australia and California. We definitely are understanding that if we do not actually manage or try and impact the environmental risks, these are going to result in social issues. And the unfortunate part of that dynamic is that it's really the poorest among our society that will get impacted most through aspects of food security and hikes in food prices, as well as migration patterns and things like that. So it's very important to understand all of that. But if I may, Andile, to your previous topic around investing and that impacting return. I think there's an additional dimension we also need to touch on, because there's two eyes. Absolutely, it's the investment side of things, but there's the incentivization side of things. So if you think about the economy holistically as well, it's very important that we able to pull on levers where we create the right outcomes and we eliminate the wrong ones. And we've seen the impact that taxation has had to impact affordability. Now, that may be in various guises around electric vehicles and things like that in more mature economies like Norway, and using that same stick to actually tax those cars that are very fossil fuel intensive. Now, I know that in South Africa, the immediate priority is around decarbonizing our electricity grid as well. But as you know, that's also going to need investment, because, you know, the Northern Cape may be very blessed with solar and wind, and the production costs based on the last auction window may be that renewables are now less than coal, but there's still investment required to be able to transport that energy and get it into the electricity grid as well. So it's just important that we also have a dimension around which we're able to do all of that. And there, that gap and that bridge also can be played, not just by governments through taxation and policies and things like that, but also through DFIs as well, with public-private partnerships, making things more bankable, reducing risk, as Olympus has said, as well as the issue of guarantees or first loss provisions and things like that. So I think that it's an all-encompassing conversation and issue around investment. But just to add to what my colleagues I think have said around the long-term time frame is also very important, as well as the aspects that they argue as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, gentlemen, there is a term that I've recently come across, and if the audience is joining us this morning, forget everything you've said. The one thing I want them to take away is this concept of just transition. Obviously, in your world, you talk about it all the time. The rest of us mere mortals don't. So I want to start with you, Brian. What is just transition, and how does it practically play itself out, whether in your specific environment, L2D, or generally speaking?
More generally speaking, I think it's around a transition from the world as we know it into a new world. And a lot of it is a fear factor. I think, you know, from the existing carbon intensive supply of energy and that to a more neutral supply of energy and that, there will be losses of jobs, losses of companies that are earning huge profits at the moment. They don't want to change, because who would want to give up those huge big profits? But there's massive opportunities, and I think it needs to be carefully managed though, and very well planned around that transition, that any loss of jobs and that can lead to upskilling in new skills that are required in the change in economy. And that's what's needed is very careful planning and very well thought through targets and goals around the changes,
right.
Around when we're going to outlaw things like and move to electric vehicles. I mean, I think Europe's already made those commitments, and that's going to have significant changes in production manufacturing facilities, as well as obviously filling stations and those kinds of facilities will all have huge changes from what they know at the moment.
Now, you know, Olympus, a part of me, I can't help but think that for developing countries, and let's talk about home and not wrap ourselves like others. Let's talk about Africa. You know, in a way, the world is moving very quickly towards a particular path. We are probably carrying the brunt of more developed countries, but they've probably more than us contributed to the situation we currently have. But nonetheless, institutions like the DBSA have to play their part in financing nations to do the right thing. You know, some people may go, it's a little bit unfair that we are also expected to do this as quickly as the rest of the world, when actually our infrastructure, the source of our electricity, as a good example, is still coming from, you know, methods that are not so friendly when it comes to a more sustainable environment. How do we respond to that in a just way? You know, and I like the idea of a just transition. What is just in our context?
Thanks, Andile, for the question. And I would like to answer it at two levels. I mean, if you're looking at it at a global level, yes, it is correct that Africa has contributed the least compared to other developed countries to climate change. Yet the impact is quite pronounced where African states are concerned. And then the question that follows from that is to say, what is the impact of the required transition on the people that would even have been impacted by the lack of development? Therefore, it looks in many ways very unfair to be asking those that have lagged behind from a development point of view to say, now accelerate your transition, which we know could have impact in terms of especially it be jobs, skills, and things like that. But I'm sure you'd see that at at least at the global level, you'd see developing countries would push an argument that says, if we are required to be accelerating, this transition, those who would have contributed more to climate change needs to, contribute significantly financially to at least lessen the impact on those who are being impacted but contributed less. Yeah. Actually, the arguments would even go to say, maybe we should even be looking at, more than just financing the transition, but also talk about the loss and damage that has happened because of climate. And of course, those becomes very sensitive discussions at that level. But I think very justified, discussions. But I think bringing it down to, at least our level from an operational point of view, it is important that, the way we approach this, we cannot just say a transition without quantifying what the impact is and showing how we are going to deal with that impact. I think that will just not fly, especially in communities where there's going to be impact. We would need to think through carefully to say, what is the potential impact? How is that going to be mitigated? So you cannot be going into, a town in Mpumalanga where you're going to close a power station and economic activity is going to stop, and you're not talking about how you're going to mitigate that. You would have to show what you are going to put in place when you shut down that power station, and you must show how that is going to impact positively the communities that are in there. But having said that, I think Brian mentioned something quite important. It's not just about looking at the negative things. There's also positive things that you can look at, which can bring about a change. For example, if you are bringing new technologies where you are able to bring new skills in a community, new jobs in a community, which hopefully can even uplift communities, it is something that we should be looking at and not only concentrating on the negative. Thanks.
Jason, I want to bring you in here because the investment community, which I've made you this Andile appointed representative of the investment community in this conversation, has been doing the right things in terms of sending messages. I remember seeing a few banks, a few financial institutions saying, no, we are no longer going to be funding any fossil fuel thing from year X. Then the question of the just transition kind of comes in there because, to Olympus's point, how do we do that in a more responsible way? So yes, it's a nice message to say that, but in an environment where there's still a lot of reliance on, I'm making an example, on coal, for example, for the generation of electricity, or companies such as Sasol and the operations that they are doing and the jobs that they are creating, how do we measure ourselves? How do we do this in a balanced way? Well, I guess at the risk of sounding controversial, in a just way, when we know what we need to do and we'd like to do it really quickly, but we've got some bread and butter issues that we got to take care of in the interim. How do we balance that?
Yeah, no, it will only come about by dialogue and a very broad-based dialogue with all stakeholders. So, within South Africa, in terms of how we even construct the integrated resource plan, which looks at what our energy mix needs to be going forward, those targets around decarbonizing sort of our grid and our energy mix has to be balanced by the socio-economic impact of it. And there's a lot of that kind of work that goes on inside the integrated resource plan to help actually make sure that communities and the impact on economic growth is not catastrophic, that leading to jobs that fall, etc., etc., etc. The one thing I do want to also just make mention of as well, as an additional dimension around just transition, and Olympus had mentioned how developed economies, and again, this is actually a talking point for COP27, around more aggressive targeting of emissions, but also funding for developing nations. So it's really square on the agenda inside the global think space. But in terms of who's contributed to what we have until now, but just also on an income level, it's important to recognize right now the answer to this equation also relates to consumption patterns. And, if I was really startled by a statistic that said the top 10% of income earners across the world are responsible through their consumption patterns for half of all CO2 emissions. That's a startling stat. By that same sort of practice, I mean the bottom rung was really responsible for very, very little impact with the consumption patterns as well. So those are also very important conversations that need to be had, not just even in South Africa, but also in developed nations around what their consumption patterns needs to be to not also impact their economic growth. So just transition, I think, is not just a conversation here inside South Africa around the impact of socioeconomic growth and economic development and jobs and things like that, but also because developed nations also understand it may impact their consumption patterns as well.
Let's move on, gentlemen. Just before I take some questions, I see we've got almost more than 10 questions actually in the chat coming through. So thank you very much to those joining us this morning. Please keep your questions coming. And just before we wrap up, I'll put them to the panel as you ask them. But before we do that, gentlemen, let's talk about reporting, which has become as a real issue when it comes to measuring. And I'm going to start with you, Brian, because you and Jason are running businesses that are listed. There's a lot of guidance from the JSE on what companies should be reporting on ESG. What's been your experience internally on kind of following those guidelines? And what are your views on how we can all improve, just so that we do have a standard of sorts that we can compare apples with apples when it comes to what companies are saying they're doing and the impact it's having, so that we can remove the risk of people kind of greenwashing and claiming to be doing the right things when actually when you look under the hood, it may not be as genuine as it looks. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we've just completed our second ESG report a couple of months ago. And it did get easier. The first one was we were fumbling our way around. I think we've tried to be as transparent as possible. And we also realized in the nature of our business with the impact of COVID, our reduction of intensities of water and energy dropped significantly in 2020 and the early parts of 2021. So we looked like heroes going from year one to year two. But we knew that as economic activity increased and we could get back into a normal functioning economy again, that it would increase. So it naturally ticked up a bit in the second year. And yeah, I think it's about transparency. I think it's about maturity. We've had lots of projects that have worked. We've had one or two that haven't worked as well, and we've disclosed those because not everything that every business tries is going to work. And that is the honest approach, I think, from our perspective, is to be transparent with people and say, we have tried this, we thought it would work, it didn't work, take the learnings and move on from there. But absolutely, ESG reporting, we've set targets. We're in the process also of setting science-based targets around our energy consumption and our carbon creation. And that's going to be a key component that we will become accountable towards. So there's a lot of different standards, and I think you also have to choose the right ones for you. You can't be chasing everything Otherwise, you'll just be spinning your tires and not really making an impact. All you'll be doing is reporting continually, but not really making a meaningful difference.
I thought I saw a target of net zero waste by 2021. We're in 2022 now. Have you reached it?
We haven't reached it. We are in the process of appointing a company that will start our certification process. So we still hope to be net zero. We would have to get 12 months of data to be accredited as net zero, but we are in the 80% now. So we are busy working with our service providers to get us to net zero over the next couple of months. And then we will start that 12-month process where we can hopefully attain net zero waste accreditation in 2023.
Well done for putting the target out. And well done for putting yourself in a position where someone like me has to ask you that question, because most people don't put the target and to avoid the question, but putting out the target there makes it front and center, right?
Andile, I think for us as well, you know, we've put very bold targets out there. I think some companies have given themselves a long runway and set targets for 2050. Our view is that needs to be revised. We've set a net zero waste, water, and carbon by 2030, which is difficult. But the companies that have set themselves this long runway, I don't believe they're making a big enough difference quickly enough, if I'm frank.
Absolutely, absolutely. Net zero carbon by 2030. You do know it's only 8 years away, right? That's going to be a tough one. Jason, let's talk asset management industry. Reporting on ESG, I know is a big issue. What's been your experience?
Yeah, no, before I even get there, I think also just in terms of net zero, you know, it is worrying a little bit because we do have an interim milestone globally, which is 2030 to get to half that. And if we don't get there, then it's like, you know, 2050 is going to be very, 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 very strained. So, it's an incredibly tough and challenging target. Yeah. But when it comes to reporting then, Andile, on the client side of things, and I think you mentioned that reporting is going to be your asset test against greenwashing. To be able to demonstrate for clients within their portfolios that global best practice, ESG thinking is manifest in the decision-making, whether it is finding its way into your process through ESG integration, or whether it is through voting mechanisms, or whether it is through robust company engagement and the monitoring and the target setting and the limits around that. But then also as an organization as well, being compliant to these various reporting frameworks is incredibly important. For instance, the one around the task force on climate-related finance disclosure. You know, it's not just the fact that Sanlam Investments needs to put its best foot forward in terms of developing world-class reporting. It must conform to some kind of a framework that everyone is sort of beholden to, because the real task of all of this is that there's some kind of a standard way in which we can collectively report across our asset management peers and financial services in general towards that. Now, I know you've mentioned aspects that the JSE has also come to the fore in terms of reporting requirements, which are extremely important, but National Treasury has also come up with green finance taxonomies, which follow on from taxonomies adopted in European markets. And even some of those requirements are a stretch for companies globally. So, you know, companies really have to be extremely sharp around what these taxonomies actually ask for, because they are really, really stringent. And the bottom line to all of this, it's going to require investment of time, investment of resources to be able to provide this kind of disclosure and reporting. Because really, as I said, the asset test against greenwashing is going to be through more robust reporting and transparency and disclosure, which is an incredibly important tenet if we are to reach positive outcomes.
Absolutely. Olympus, in your world, I know that you have your own target as a DBSA. It'd be nice to hear how you're doing on those and what those are, but also reporting for you as a financier has to be top of the list, because how else do you know that you're having the impact that you wish for?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think all of us, when we approach COP, especially now going towards COP27, everybody would like to publish some targets, but it's another thing to report against that. we have recently released our commitments around, net zero by 2050. We're currently working on intermediate targets, which I think is quite important in focusing the work that we do. Other targets that we had set was really to measure our financial flows into both mitigation and adaptation projects. The last review of our portfolio, we had found out that we have actually done quite a lot better than what we had targeted in terms of financial flows. But yeah, the big test now for us will be setting those intermediate targets towards 2050 and ensuring that we respond accordingly. But I think what is key is that it's a lot easier to publish targets, but the transparency issue that has been mentioned and the sheer amount of work, the expertise, the processes, the tools that are required to meet these reporting obligations cannot be underestimated. It's actually quite serious, and I think companies need to be investing significantly in resources that would ensure that we report accordingly. From a DBSA point of view, what is helpful is that we are also part of a club of international DFIs where we share common tools and principles around reporting, and we share lessons. And that has been quite useful. And we are also using that in setting these intermediate targets that I referred to. But we cannot underestimate the task that is ahead where reporting is concerned. It's a very key thing if we are to meet our targets.
Absolutely. And Brian, do you think we're ever going to get to a point where there's, call it independent third-party verification, almost like an auditor in the financial sense, but somebody that says, okay, indeed, what they said happened?
Yeah, I think as the industry matures, I think ESG is very much, everyone's aware of it these days and has become very mainstream. 3-4 years ago, nobody knew what it was. And as the industry matures, it will get more robust, and there will be a more strict reporting processes and audit type of processes to make sure that people are achieving what they're reporting on or what their targets are.
That's an interesting time to live. We may very well have auditors of ESG soon. But anyway, we'll see how that plays out. Ladies and gents, it's come to that time when I open the floor for your questions. I do have quite a few to get through, but please, there's still enough time for us to get to yours. So if you haven't yet done so, please send your questions. The first one, and I'm going to send this one to you, Jason. It comes from Putela. And then, of course, I'm going to open to the floor for other guys who might want to contribute to it. Interesting question. He says, is it the responsibility of business to preserve the environment while consumers are exonerated and government plays referee? So we've all taken on this question of ESG. We all are very clear what we need to do as business, but is it our responsibility and are consumers and government exonerated?
I think it's the responsibility of business and consumers as well as government to help work together to forge a collective response. And I know that sounds incredibly diplomatic at the moment, but I think I mentioned before as well, there's a production side of things and there's a consumption side of things. And if, let's say, for instance, there's various dynamics of the way in which these things interplay with one another, but if the consumption side of things changes their consuming patterns to be a lot more greener, then that would instill a change also on the production side of things. On the production side of things, I think if there's a different energy mix to create things more efficiently to show consumers that it doesn't even impact their lives, then less of that will also happen. So I think a lot of these dynamics, I think, that unfold is something that I see the conversations a little bit more had. The person who directed the question around the responsibility of consumers is a conversation that's a little bit more at the forefront in developed economies, because they're really worried about the ways in which they need to change their consumption patterns and how that may impact their lives as we get towards a net zero outcome. Aspects also about, how do we report on net zero? Is it at the production side of things or is it at the consumption side of things is also a very important thing. So the business side of things or the consumer side of things. When developed economies also report aspects around net zero, are they just exporting their carbon footprint to poorer nations as well? So it's a very, very good and pertinent question, and one that I have noted to be a little bit more topical in terms of balancing the consumer's role and the business role is a little bit more around in mature and developed economies, because a lot of those consumers and citizens are worried about how net zero may impact their consumption patterns and way of life.
Let's ask somebody who deals with consumers every day. Brian, what's your thought?
Yeah, I've got a strong view. Consumers are certainly not exonerated. It's up to everyone. But I guess at a practical level, if you're buying clothing from a manufacturer that's not using very eco-friendly methods of production, as a consumer, you can apply pressure, but it'll take time. But it is up to that manufacturing company or that clothing company to make sure that they lead the change that then allows consumers to be buying more green or eco-friendly products, etc. But there's definitely the responsibility is everyone's. I mean, with any one of the three legs not working, the whole thing will fall apart.
Absolutely. Let's move on. I've got a question for you, Olympus, specifically for the DBSA. Alia Kaji has a controversial one for you, Chief. And she says, thanks for the topic. Can the DBSA really mobilize in the direction we need if there's still funding for clean coal? Should we not move away completely from coal to meet the Paris Agreement targets? Because yet DBSA is funding clean coal. Olympus?
That is an interesting question. So you'd have seen that in the public, we have released a commitment from a DBSA point of view, especially with regard to our net zero targets. And what we have clearly stated is that the DBSA will only look at financing fossil fuel projects only where there's a clear and unambiguous transition plan. So what we seek to do is to say, we are dealing with a climate emergency. We need to move with speed. But at the same time, how you time your transition, especially in developing economies like ourselves, is quite important so that the good that you do doesn't seem to be creating unintended consequences. Therefore, the timing that you apply is quite key. So then we back off and say, ideally, we would not want to, be investing, in projects that we know would be detrimental to our environment. But considering where we are and a responsible transition plan, would talk to only us considering fossil fuel projects if there is a clear and robust, unambiguous transition plan. So we would only want to support project sponsors that are seriously taking the transition away from fossil fuel towards low carbon development and help them through that journey in a way that is responsible. So that's really how we are responding to that. Thanks.
Great stuff. Great question. Great answer as well. Next one is, how long will the transition in just transition last? It seems as if there is no real timeline. By next year, this time exactly, we will still be transitioning, or will we still be transitioning? And what will be the key indicators or milestones that we are moving along? Jason, I guess COP27 is trying to put some kind of global standards to these kind of things. 2050 has been bandied around, but maybe some education for the rest of us who are not close to it. A transition until when? What are the timelines on most targets?
Yeah, so what I can look, there's very clear and ambitious targets around sort of net zero to get us to 2050 and the interim target at 2030. Developing economies are working with timelines around 2060 to get there. And I think the transition there is going to probably be aligned to those timelines. But how we get to, just transitions and the pathways around that quicker is going to be a function of the two I's, as I mentioned earlier, investment And yes, look, Sanlam can try and mobilize as much of its balance sheet to be able to invest in these kinds of things and draw third-party capital, and we've done so successfully, even in our recently launched infrastructure fund and our climate fund business. But it most certainly is going to require a lot more investment to actually get us there. For instance, we know that the emphasis is on renewables at the moment, but what about electric vehicles? What about green steel? What about impacting agriculture? What about exciting technologies that need to scale, like carbon capture and storage? These big plants that can suck carbon out or carbon out of the atmosphere. The technologies are there. They need to be invested in to create scale as well. And that can also sort of improve the pathway and the trajectory for what it means for just transitions, and have that energy mix still here with some element of fossil fuels so that we don't impact the environment negatively. So it's a very, very interesting question. The part that I haven't touched on is around the incentivization. I think I mentioned it earlier in the conversation, but it's one that requires a hell of a lot of thought and think around it, because in terms of making products more affordable, the ones that are actually very green, I mean, at this point in time, if you looked at your shopping basket and you just wanted to go green, as a consumer, the reason why you're averse to it is because these prices are just staggering. So electric cars here in South Africa, the prices are just crazy. So the mechanisms through taxation and other means to make things more affordable, and then to tax those that are and disproportionately tax those that are sort of contributing to the problem, is also something that needs an answer, because you've seen some fantastic outcomes, like for instance in Norway. It's not because the Norwegian people are somehow more sort of environmentally conscious, but because the mechanisms are there in place and policies are there, and the time's been given to a point where in 2011, 3% of new cars was electric that was bought, and now 2/3 of new cars that are bought in Norway are sort of electric. So I know that there's an emphasis in South Africa also around renewables and the electrical grid, and there's good reason for that, because energy across industry and transport and buildings consume produce 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions. But we need to also be more broad-based in our thinking around solution sets as well, because those things can also naturally affect the just transition time frame, and can really assist us to make it as less onerous as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. We're already running out of time. We've got a lot of questions that unfortunately, we couldn't get a chance to get them answered. Thank you so much for your time. I just thought I'd give you each just 30 seconds parting shot on our theme, kind of going forward, and your own personal plans in your organizations around positive impact through sustainable investing. Let me start with you, Brian.
Thanks, Andile. I think it's just to lay down a challenge for everyone to push themselves as hard as possible, whether it's at a personal level or whether it's at an organizational level, is to set lofty targets. And if you do fall slightly short, at least you've made a big effort and you've made a difference. So that would be my parting shot.
Thanks, Brian. Olympus?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think for us, we see really the avenue that is being used by countries, especially in our region, through their nationally determined contribution to respond to climate change. And we see ourselves as an important partner from a financing point of view to bring on board appropriate financing instruments that would help in the implementation of activities that really advance those targets that have been set. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Olympus from the DBSA. Jason?
Thanks, Andile, and thanks to the Financial Mail for being able to participate in a very, very important conversation. I think my message and parting message is to get involved and to contribute. I think the importance also inside our organization around continuous learning and education around the topic is important. So I think as individuals as well, I think it's important for us to actually upskill and read more up about a lot of these specific issues that are going to impact us, but also our children and their children's children. I mean, we definitely want to provide them with a better world to live in. And then when it comes to sort of your investments as well, I think it's important to understand whether you're going to reach your investment outcomes for retirement and various other targets, but also engage your asset manager around what they're doing around a lot of these specific issues to help create a world where we are reaching good, positive outcomes.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. And thank you for the intriguing questions you put onto the panel. And thank you for all the things we've all learned, especially those of us that are not very close to this particular issue. We've certainly learned a lot this morning, just transition and many other concepts that are very real as we move on to a more responsible world, and one that seeks to make not just financially returning kind of investment, but also ones that come with environmental returns. Thank you also to the Financial Mail, DBSA, Sanlam Investments, and Liberty 2 Degrees as partners on this particular one. The series, of course, continues, so please do join us on the 9th of June at 2 o'clock, and there we will be focusing on job creation. My name is Andile Khumalo, and have a good day further.